Good day, folks. Welcome to our discussion about regarding the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and how the United States dealt with the Great Depression. Here we see a famous painting from this era, Construction of a Dam. It's by William Grapper, painted in 1939, and this was a mural for the new Department of Interior building in Washington, D.C. Department of Interior had been around for some time, but during the New Deal, one of the big initiatives was to, construct more buildings, paint murals, all these kinds of things to put people to work. And here is one of those paintings here. And Grapper was a social realist. A lot of these artists would depict, workers working, but also to kind of show the struggle of labor in trying to find work itself. And the painting is in Art Deco design. Art Deco became very popular, really around, in Europe and the United States in the late 1920s, well into the 1940s. For example, the Empire State Building is an Art Deco. But anyway, what we want to look at here with the New Deal. Basically, first of all, the coalition that forms, who makes up this new coalition, because we're going to see a brand new alignment of the Democratic Party with this New Deal that makes it look much more like it is today. And more so, we're going to talk about, too, how the New Deal changes how the government, the U.S. government, interacts with its citizens, and the expectation that citizens now have regarding the government. And some of the terms that we'll look at here, obviously Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will be president under the New Deal, of course, creates the New Deal. And he's the only president in American history that will be elected to 4 terms. He dies early in his 4th term, but nonetheless, Roosevelt elected to 4 terms. No other president's been elected to more than 2. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is going to play a fundamental role in getting the word out about the New Deal. And we'll talk about these other things as we go along, too. So just to give you kind of a general timeline of what goes on with the New Deal. So, FDR gets elected in 32. He wins in a landslide over Herbert Hoover. The whole Depression is basically blamed on Herbert Hoover, even though the fact of the matter is that FDR didn't do really a whole heck of a lot more to actually pull the U.S. out of the Depression than Hoover was doing. But nonetheless, FDR comes in, and he begins with his 100 days. The first 100 days of a presidency are considered to be like the honeymoon period, if you will, for a president, where basically, Congress is more willing to work with the president and so on. So the first 100 days of any administration, but especially when FDR comes in, as the Depression is getting underway, is huge. And FDR is going to do a lot of things to try to get the economy going right away, including a bank holiday. We'll talk about on a slide or two. But nonetheless, workers want to work. They need to pay. And in 1934, we're going to see a big wave of strikes. But the federal government is going to try to react to that to create better labor standards, better pay and hours, things like this for workers, and just directly hire workers as well. Basically, we're going to see really a series of New Deals. The second New Deal will get underway as we roll into FDR's late first term, but into his second term. And what he's going to run into there, as you see in 34, 35, is some issues with the Supreme Court, because the New Deal creates a lot of federal agencies. And then the question becomes, okay, is it legal for the federal government to come out and begin to try to control economics in certain regions of the country, assign work, assign jobs, provide work, pay farmers to not grow crops? Are these types of things legal? And that becomes the big question. And the Supreme Court's going to strike some of these down. Some of these organizations that are founded under the New Deal. Well, FDR is reelected in 36, and FDR tries something infamous really he tries the so-called court packing scheme, where basically he tries to add more justices to the Supreme Court, because if he has more justices, then those are more justices that might support his initiatives. Anyway, as we roll into the later 30s, it's very clear that the New Deal is not going to pull the U.S. out of the Depression. It never does. It's going to take World War II to do that. But by the time we get to the late 30s, as a reform movement, the New Deal itself is coming to an end. Republicans in 38, as well as a lot of conservative Democrats, regain seats in Congress, particularly the House, and the New Deal kind of fades away. But as it's fading away, conflict is looking inevitable, and then of course World War II begins by 1939, which the U.S. won't join until 1941, but the U.S. will be helping out Britain and France and allies well before it joins the war. And then you see FDR, a very rare picture. The media actually agreed not to picture the president in his wheelchair. FDR was struck with polio in his late 30s, I think 38 or 39, and it debilitated him from the waist down. So FDR had no use of his legs. There's, sometimes you'll see footage of him standing. It's because he has these large 10-pound metal braces locking his legs in place. And he would often, hold like someone's elbow walking next to him. But, it looked like he's walking. And, this is the kind of image that the government wanted to convey to the American people in the time of the Great Depression. FDR even had a special car made where he would use hand controls to operate it. But, when it's seen on newsreels, film reels that Americans might watch, it looks like he's just this, perfectly healthy guy driving around in a car. Okay, so the whole idea here is that FDR and his administration, they're trying to pull the U.S., out of the Depression. And basically the first New Deal, he announces a New Deal for the American people, and basically consists of the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And right away, relief and immediate recovery are the first 2 goals rolling in. And FDR's famous inaugural speech, where he, maybe the most famous line, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Pushing the American people to say, hey, we can get through this. We have to join together and get through, the worst economic depression really in human history. And what FDR would do is he would hold these fireside chats where basically, as you can see there, he would sit behind some microphones, and yes, that's CBS, NBC, and so on, like we know today. And he would broadcast over the radio, and people would listen in on the radio, and FDR would talk about successes of the New Deal. He would talk about once, conflict starts to kind of build up in Europe, he would talk about Americans staying neutral and things like this. But ideally, what these so-called fireside chats would do overall was to inspire or instill confidence and keep Americans inspired and hopeful that, the next day is going to be better than today. And overall, with FDR, what he's really able to do is he really concentrates power into the hands of the executive. In other words, the presidency itself, that office, is going to become stronger than ever under FDR and some of his policies with the New Deal. And FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and a distant cousin, she is, kind of the legs of this operation, literally, because, FDR was difficult for him to get around, but Eleanor Roosevelt could, go across the country and really sell the New Deal, and she does. And overall, women overall are finally gaining a foothold in politics. We're going to see our first female cabinet secretary, Frances Perkins, in FDR's administration. We're going to see Eleanor Roosevelt, who becomes internationally famous. But, first of all, calling for, the New Deal and getting support for it, visiting workers and things like this, and really getting women involved in politics itself more so than previously. And Eleanor Roosevelt's going to remain extremely famous, popular. She's going to help push for a universal declaration of human rights after World War II, after FDR, of course, has died, but really pressing for humanity itself, as well as women's rights, civil rights for everyone. And there you see Frances Perkins, FDR Secretary of Labor. So she was actually the first female to hold a cabinet position, executive office. Okay, so in the midst of the Depression, at the very start, basically, the U.S. government is calling for a bank holiday. And FDR, once he comes in, calls for a bank holiday where basically he says, look, stop running to the banks and taking out your money or trying to take out all your money. We're going to close down the banks for a few days. We're going to let them gain some financial solvency, get reorganized. And then we're going to reopen the banks and try to get back to business as usual. But what he's trying to avoid are these runs on the bank. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, the great Christmas movie, black and white Christmas movie, where George Bailey is running his bank, right? And all of a sudden all these people are flocking into the bank is because they want to get their money out. Because at this time, if you had money in the bank and the bank goes out of business, you don't have any money in the bank. There was no insurance. But the Great Depression and the bank holiday, this is leading to that, where the government's finally going to create the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And basically what this does is it insures the money that you have in the bank. It's like 250 grand, 400 grand for an account today. So if that bank goes under today, you still recoup that money. But back during this time, before the early 1930s, people would make runs on the banks to get their money out because they may never get it back. So overall, what this New Deal is about is it really adopts, in Britain and France, or mostly Britain, well, especially Britain, I should say, are kind of doing this as well. John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics, and this new economic policy that's going to be used in the New Deal really is the foundations for what the Democratic Party and what liberalism today is going to come to mean. And basically, liberalism during the New Deal comes to mean really more what it is about today, where you have the government much more active, right? The government exists to uplift, the less fortunate. The government exists to guarantee safety of the American people, things like this. And basically the government being more involved in your life on a regular basis comes about with the New Deal. And I mean, FDR, for example, he called owning a home an American birthright, right? That you deserve to own a home, that it's one of your natural liberties to have, right? So really, he's basically saying that the government is going to look over you and assure you that you can be successful. So, and that's a huge controversy today, and it always will be in U.S. politics or any country's politics, is how much government involvement should there be in people's lives. And it seems like every election is about just about that. But the reality is this: the New Deal is not going to pull the U.S. out of the Depression, not even close. It's going to take the spending of World War II, the mass employment of World War II, and U.S. global economic dominance after World War II that pulls the United States, and really to an extent the world, out of depression in the years for the U.S. and during the war, but then really for everyone else, shortly after the war in the years following. But the reality is that the New Deal, it didn't generate prosperity. It didn't create wealth for anyone. And the other aspect of the New Deal that people don't understand is that the New Deal wasn't trying to create communism or socialism. The New Deal was trying to save capitalism. The New Deal was a capitalist initiative, right? The idea was that, with Keynesian economics, you kind of prime the pump and throw some money out there to get businesses going again, right? But that was the original intent. But what the New Deal creates with all the government organizations creates what looks more today, what you would call a more socialistic approach. And that is John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, And he basically, develops this idea of, priming the pump. And overall, with Roosevelt and his administration, what we're going to see is an entirely new coalition within the Democratic Party. A party coalition basically is what the party is made up of in terms of its electorate, right? Segments of society, the demographics that make up the party. So, for example, in this case, the kind of New Deal Democratic Party coalition that comes about is going to include farmers. It's going to include Southern bigots, white supremacists. It's going to include industrial workers. It's going to include Northern African Americans. So it's this odd amalgamation, this odd grouping of people who normally would not get along together, but the politics of the New Deal and the realities of the Great Depression drive these people into the same political party. So we kind of start to see the new American left, where we see a lot of socialists and communists, labor radicals, people to the far left of the spectrum, joining with the new left of America, very much like the left as we know it today. And, the left today, for example, would call for things like, universal health care, regulation of corporations and businesses. That's very typical. Not that the right doesn't, call for those things too, but, the left more especially, and more government involvement. And most of this comes from really the whole large-scale government spending that came with Keynesian economics during the New Deal. And the idea is that you, quote, prime the pump, unquote, of the economy, right? Just throw some money out there in an organized fashion, of course, to try to get businesses, people on their feet to get the economy going again. Well, what FDR does is he creates a massive, massive list of these federal programs, these federal organizations, and this is just 10 of them here. There are way more than this. You just have this kind of alphabet soup of acronyms: Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Public Works Administration, PWA, Rural Electrification, RFA. So all these different acronyms, but each of these are their own organization, and each of these came into existence to serve a very particular purpose. For example, you see the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Basically, this came in to try to help farmers. And the way they tried to help farmers was they paid farmers to destroy their crops. And the idea was, to try to create more scarcity to drive up prices and values of crops. Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. It's going to be made up of basically kids out of high school, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old young men who go out and plant trees, build bridges, they update parks, they create pathways through parks. You can go to almost any park in the state and you will see a little sign sometimes that says this, made possible by the CCC all the way back in the 1930s, Civilian Conservation Corps. And essentially, this keeps people busy, right? It keeps this young segment of your population working, doing something. But here is an interesting example. This will eventually be declared unconstitutional, the AAA. But when this comes out, the idea was to raise farm prices, and pay farmers not to plant. You have food and livestock being destroyed during the New Deal because they're trying to raise prices and help farmers out. And, it's within these 100 days. Here's what you see with this cartoon. You see FDR there cooking up, I guess, some stew of all of these new organizations that are coming out. And you even see songs for the New Deal and things like this, kids learning about all these different programs and kind of supporting, these initiatives to try to help, pull the country out of depression. Another prominent organization, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. This is where you would have gotten money funding for example, the painting that we looked at to start this discussion. This organization would pay artists, as you see, like a metal worker, carpenters, sculptors, whatever, to create murals, paintings, statues, whatever, for public buildings, government buildings, and so on. And it keeps these people gainfully employed and keeps them as part of the economy. Just anything to try to get the economy going. Another very critical administration will be founded, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which is still around today. The TVA will often work in conjunction with the CCC, for example, on this Big Ridge Dam in Tennessee. But what the TVA does is, first of all, they are a government company, right? So in this case, the federal government created the Tennessee Valley Authority to compete with other businesses selling electricity, right? So it would be kind of like the United States Post Office, competing with UPS and FedEx. And this is the first time where the federal government created kind of its own business to compete with private businesses. But the TVA, as you can see in the map there, I mean, northern Georgia, pretty much all of Tennessee, down in the south here in the Blue Ridge Mountains and Smoky Mountains, this is where finally electricity is brought to these places. It's not until the 1930s, and it's called rural electrification, and also creating more waterways with dams and building roads and things like this through these mountain passes and through these regions that you see in the green. Civilian Conservation Corps, this was supposedly FDR's favorite. This just put young men to work, as I talked about earlier. And it was mostly in the national parks, building bridges, clearing out hiking trails, things like that. And it keeps this young segment of your population working, right? I mean, the last thing you want are young men, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, out of work with nothing to do. I mean, you could be talking about, destabilizing your society with, riots or protests or, violence, whatever. So the idea is you keep these young men active and working and industrious. Another one of the more famous ones, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. What this organization did was that it set these codes for proper conduct of business in favor of labor. For example, assuring that wages remain stable, that companies don't raise and drop wages to try to manipulate how much they can pay workers. It limited work hours. And assured that you were going to receive a particular wage for the amount of work that you did. This will eventually be declared unconstitutional, the NRA, but basically the NRA is what really pushes forth the unionization, the reunionization. Because of the NRA, numerous worker unions are going to form. And if you were a business that followed the policies of the NRA, which workers saw as treating workers fairly, your company might gain more patronage than a company that didn't have the NRA. And you would see companies that would put the eagle in their window, the blue eagle there, to represent that they were a member of the NRA. And like I said, this is going to help lead to unions just exploding onto the scene, unions growing exponentially, and it's going to be worker unions that very much join with this Democratic Party, this New Deal coalition. And FYI, you can see the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles were founded in the early 1930s, and the owners actually were inspired by the NRA and the eagle. So thus the Philadelphia Eagles, because of the New Deal program. Rural electrification, talked about this, finally bringing electricity to rural areas, to farmers, right? Remember, electricity was reserved seemingly for the cities and for the wealthy. So with the New Deal, we're finally seeing electricity being brought out to the countryside. And just giving an idea of FDR's popularity, He runs against this guy Alf Landon, and just blows him out of the water. FDR by 36 when he runs for his second term, second of 4 elected. He's this kind of unstoppable force. FDR has become immensely popular, more popular in every segment of the population than his competition. And you can see here that the New Deal, FDR, the Democrats are much more favored too by the African American segment of the electorate. The constituency of African Americans voting, very much for the New Deal, though ironically the New Deal had some major issues in terms of equal treatment of peoples, especially for African Americans. For example, once Social Security is rolled out, it doesn't offer coverage for example, housemaids and things like this. But those types of jobs were what African Americans were able to gain access to, especially female African Americans. So, things like Social Security aren't going to be really made available to them. Two, you still have the Solid South. So even though you have New Deal policies, FDR is not exactly sending the federal government down to the South to make sure that the New Deal is beneficial for all segments of the population. But basically, FDR then will initiate this his second New Deal. And really, the second New Deal is brought about because the first one didn't finish the job. It didn't really, accomplish pulling the country out of the Depression. And at the same time, people are calling for greater economic equality and things like this. So you got to kind of keep, FDR at this point has to kind of keep the New Deal rolling along. In assuring this kind of parity that is, very much become part of the how Americans expect to live at this juncture under this New Deal, to make sure that everyone is working, everyone's receiving pay, things like this. And like it says here, and like I said earlier, the Solid South, though, is going to make sure that the New Deal, it becomes this kind of welfare state, but it's only an entitlement for white Americans, for example. And to make matters worse, the final insult, in the midst of Depression, you also have the Great Dust Bowl, and the Great Plains just absolutely obliterated. What had basically happened here was for, decade after decade after decade, farmers were plowing the same land, using a lot of the same crops. And basically, once drier conditions hit, that dirt, once it lost all of its nutrients, basically becomes sand. And you would just have these huge sandstorm, dust storms across what comes to be called the Dust Bowl, and people just living in misery in the heart of the United States. And many of those people will try to migrate out and, of course, move to the West. A very famous book about that, The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. And you can see right in the heart of the country, where the devastating Dust Bowl took place. And part of the with the New Deal had workers, these photographers that would go out, and these photographers would take official pictures, images, like you see here, of people maybe making the trek west or just trying to live on their land or trying to get by. And arguably one of the most famous images of this is the migrant mother you see there on the left, and Dorothea Lange there on the right. She was one of these prominent photographers, paid by the government to go out and take images of the United States and its people as it goes through this depression. And you can see the migrant mother here with 3 children, the infant in her lap there, and you just see the kind of desperation, on this woman's face, and her children just kind of, nestling around her, trying to get protection. Well, with the second New Deal, I shouldn't say the second, at the end of FDR's first term, but really what will go into effect by the second New Deal, is the Social Security Act. And Social Security Act is finally going to be essentially a way for workers to save up money so that they can, I don't know, retire. And it's the first time that the U.S. government actually creates a pension system. Now, these types of systems had been, for example, in Germany all the way back in the 1880s. But the United States finally develops this Social Security Act to so that workers, as they work, they put so much money into it and then can receive that money back once they retire. And of course, Social Security is a huge issue today, and it's its solvency, whether or not it has enough money. But this really begins during this New Deal with this idea of the government working to help uplift its citizens. Two of the major labor unions are actually going to merge close to this time. American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations will come to be called the AFL-CIO. And you can see, like, the AFL was a little bit more exclusive, right? It was bigoted, only allowing whites, only wanted skilled workers. It was very anti-immigrant, whereas the CIO, even if you were somewhat skilled or whatever, you could actually get in. Females could get in to the CIO, as well as immigrants and Black Americans. Eventually, these two will merge into a massive labor union, the AFL-CIO, as we know it today. And this is just a poster here talking about labor unions and the CIO in particular. And the CIO came out and advocated for creating anti-lynching laws and helping African Americans gain right to vote in the South. So this one becomes obviously very attractive for African American workers, and overall, like we pointed out earlier, labor unions themselves becoming extremely popular during this time. And you can see that the Great Depression doesn't exactly get the U.S. out. The New Deal doesn't exactly get the U.S. out of the Great Depression, but what it does is it does create major power for unions. Depressions typically destroyed unions, going back to Coxey's Army, for example, and attempts to unionize. But this depression allows for a rise in union membership and for workers to gain more power. And this just depicts a tactic that workers would use, a sit-down strike, where basically, this is in Flint, Michigan, General Motors plant, I think. But nonetheless, workers would actually stay in the factory. They'd keep the machines, in working order, keep them up, but not actually do the labor, holding out for higher pay, better working conditions, and so on. Another sit-in strike here at the Goody Nut Shop. Well, not everybody just sits back and accepts the New Deal. I mean, you have a lot of, especially wealthier Americans, who see the New Deal as a threat to their power, to their status. You have others like Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, especially Huey Long, who says, "Hey, you know what? This New Deal doesn't go far enough." People like Huey Long viewed the New Deal as basically just wealthy politicians collaborating. People like Huey Long, he called for sharing the wealth, basically as kind of redistribution of wealth. So really, I mean, very much this kind of socialist, almost kind of communistic approach to governing that Huey Long has down there in Louisiana. Father Charles Coughlin, he was a Catholic priest, and he would get on the radio and criticize FDR. He at first actually supported it, the New Deal, but eventually his sermons became very anti-Semitic. He claimed that FDR was close with Jewish bankers, and that the government was too much in cahoots with these bankers. So he would just attack these people. He later became a supporter of a lot of the fascist movements in Europe, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, but very much anti-Semitic and much more conservative. As we move through the 30s, was Coughlin in attacking FDR and the New Deal. And there you see Huey Long. Huey Long was actually assassinated in 1935 at a courthouse down in Louisiana. He was actually moving to try to have a opponent of his removed. I think he was a judge or something, and the guy's son came out and shot Huey Long and killed him. He died about a day and a half later. Huey Long's bodyguards immediately came up to the assassin and started shooting him. He had like 50 or 60 bullet wounds, bullet holes in him. So he died as well. And there you see Charles Coughlin down there on the bottom, who called for this idea of social justice, but blamed, the so-called Jewish bankers for keeping the poor in poverty. And later he becomes this, kind of fascist supporter. So nonetheless, not everyone supported the New Deal, right? This wasn't just carte blanche, oh, FDR, we love you, right? You definitely had major opponents coming from both sides with the New Deal. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. There's some more reading for you if you're interested in the topic. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you up next time.